This video is a collection of all my previous videos about the wheeled vehicles and half-tracks of World War II. Here you can find the American and German half-tracks, the history of the Jeep and its German counterpart the Kübelwagen, amphibious vehicles, and the M8 Greyhound armored car. This way you can find them all in one place without searching through the channel. So without further ado, let's begin. Chapter 1. The German half-tracks of World War II. The German half-track vehicles of World War II, a familiar sight to anyone watching documentaries or war movies. Though the most well-known of these vehicles is the so-called Hanomag, the armored troop carrier, mainly used by the Panzer Grenadiers. But actually, the German army used lots of different types of half-track vehicles. So today we will take a look at all of them, talk a little bit of all the types, but we will only go into more details on the armored personnel carrier versions. So without further ado, let's begin. Most countries looked into the half-track vehicles during the 1930s and tried them for several roles. The French Citroën Cagresse vehicles, for example, or the US Army Scout cars like the T7, which eventually was developed to the M2 and M3 half-tracks. I have already made a video on these American vehicles, so if you're interested in their history, check it out. The German army was no exception, and during the 1930s developed a lot of different types of half-track vehicles. The advantages of the half-track over the normal wheeled vehicle far surpass the drawbacks, especially when we talk about heavy towing vehicles and artillery tractors, which would carry heavy equipment and tow heavy cannons over rough terrain. So low ground pressure and high traction was a very important factor for these vehicles. As mentioned, the German army had several different vehicles developed during the 1930s, and later during World War II new ones appeared, some of them purpose-built, some of them just modified from already used trucks. So let's see which were these vehicles. To keep things simple, we will not look at them by size or development date, but simply go by their designation numbers. What do these designations actually mean though? The SDKFZ is an abbreviation of the German Sonderkraftfahrzeug, or special purpose vehicle. Basically, every German military vehicle was designated as the KFZ and their own numbers. Now we know what the naming means, so let's start looking at the different half-track vehicles. The first one on our list is the SD-KFZ-2. The so-called Kettenrad was a half-track motorcycle, originally developed for airborne troops. It was designed in 1939 and entered service in 1941, and it was first used in the invasion of the Soviet Union. The idea behind it was to have a light and small vehicle, but with good traction, that is able to carry cargo over rough terrain. They were used to lay communication cables and carry heavy air loads, and also used on airfields as towing vehicles. The next one is the SD-KFZ-3, or the Maultier, German for mule. This designation covers a series of half-track trucks, which were not purpose-built but modified. The German troops, after invading the Soviet Union, soon realized that there was no road network as such, and their wheeled vehicles had difficulties operating in the deep mud and later snow on the Eastern Front. Half-tracks were much more usable, but those were mainly used as artillery tractors, and could not be removed from their role just to carry equipment. So the Germans came up with the idea that the already used Opel Ford and Daimler trucks should be modified with Panzer I and II tracks. These were in use from 1942 until the end of the war. Opel designed its own tracked running gear version, but this was not used in the end. Instead, a simpler Horstman-style suspension was preferred, which was almost identical to the one used on the British Universal Carrier, or its American version, the T16. Of course, these vehicles were not as good as the purpose-built half-tracks, but they were much better than the original rear-wheel drive trucks. Some of them later received armor plating and became the SD-KFZ-4 models. A modification of these vehicles carried the 15 cm Panzerwerfer rocket launcher. The next SD-KFZ-6 was a 5-ton purpose-built vehicle designed for the medium artillery tractor role. This vehicle was designed before World War II, and around 3,500 units were built until the end of the war. It could carry 11 men and around 500 kg cargo, and tow a gun or engineering equipment. It had a variant carrying a 37mm gun, and a few anti-tank conversions were built using captured Soviet 76mm guns. The SD-KFZ-7 was a bigger 8-ton purpose-built half-track of the German army. Designed in 1934, it was in service from 1938 until the end of the war. It was mainly intended to tow the 88mm anti-aircraft guns or 150mm howitzers. It could carry 12 men or almost 2 tons of cargo, and had a towing limit of 8 tons. The vehicle had 2 anti-aircraft variants, one equipped with 4 20mm cannons, the other one with one 37mm cannon. Though the SD-KFZ-7 looks quite similar to the SD-KFZ-6, but you can tell them apart by some differences. The 7 had a bigger cargo area and a bigger overhang at the rear. The side access doors are wider on the 7 and taller on the 6. After a few of these vehicles were captured, the British tried to build their own version. Bedford designed the vehicle. It was called Tracklet, and it did quite well on trials, but in the end it didn't go to production. The SD-KFZ-8 was a 12-ton purpose-built half-track, also designed before the war. It was developed to tow very heavy artillery pieces, like the 210mm mortars or 170mm cannons. It was powered by an 8.5-liter petrol engine, could carry 11 men or 2.5 tons of cargo, and had a towing capacity of 12 tons. Sometimes they were used as recovery vehicles, making use of their huge towing capabilities. 10 of them were converted to carry the 88mm guns in anti-tank role. These received a different armored cabin, armor protection around the engine, and a big gun shield for the gun crew. The SD-KFZ-8, apart from being overall larger than the smaller half-tracks, can be identified by the more rounded grille, the larger road wheels in the tracks, the raised front and rear sprockets, and the hump in the mudguard over the front sprocket. The heaviest of the German purpose-built half-tracks was the SD-KFZ-9, an 18-ton truck. These were used to tow the heaviest artillery pieces, like the 240mm cannons, and also employed as tank recovery vehicles. It was powered by a 10.8-liter petrol engine and had a towing capacity of 28 tons. It had different variants for tank maintenance crews, mounting cranes with 6 or 10-ton lifting capacity. 14 of these vehicles were also converted for anti-tank role, mounting the 88mm cannon, and received armor plating around the engine and crew compartment. This vehicle looks very similar to the SD-KFZ-8, but again it is longer and larger overall. The easiest features to identify the SD-KFZ-9 is the fewer and larger cooling slots on the side of the engine compartment, and the front and rear sprockets are larger and less raised than on the SD-KFZ-8. The SD-KFZ-10 was the smallest of the purpose-built German half-tracks, with the exception of the Kettenrad, of course. It was designed to tow light equipment, like the 20 or 37mm anti-tank guns. The vehicle was powered by a 4.2-liter petrol engine, could carry 8 men, and had a towing capacity of 1 ton. It had several variants. The 1, 2, and 3 were chemical warfare versions, the 1 being a chemical detection vehicle, the 2 a decontamination vehicle, and the 3 a poison gas dispenser vehicle. The variants 4 and 5 carried 20mm anti-aircraft cannons. Identifying features for the SD-KFZ-10 are the horizontal straight mudguard over the tracks, and the very low engine compartment, almost in level with the front fenders. This vehicle was the base for the SD-KFZ-250 light armored personnel carrier, which we will take a closer look at in a few minutes. The last one on our list is the SD KFZ-11, which was a 3-ton half-track developed to tow medium guns. This vehicle was also purpose-built and entered service before the war. It used a 4.2-liter petrol engine, could carry 8 men or 1800 kilograms of cargo, and had a towing capacity of 3 tons. It was also used as an ammo carrier and had versions for chemical warfare, just like the SD KFZ-10. Identifying features are the higher engine compartment than the SD KFZ-10, and the front fenders and track mudguards are made from a single piece of metal. This vehicle was the base for the SD KFZ-251 variant. And with this we arrive to the 2 armored personnel carriers, which we will take a closer look at. As the German doctrine placed the tanks in the center of their tactics, it became clear that motorized infantry will need something better than just trucks to follow the tanks. In 1939, the Inspectorate for Motorized Troops put out a request for armored troop carriers. 2 designs were developed, a light armored personnel carrier, the SD KFZ-250, and a medium armored personnel carrier, the SD KFZ-251. For the smaller vehicle, the SD KFZ-10 was selected as a base, and the manufacturer of the half-track, Demag, set to work on the new design. The new vehicle used the same tracks, front axle, and drivetrain as the SD KFZ-10, but the tracks were shortened compared to the base vehicle. The vehicle was designed in about a year and entered service in 1941. The new design, contrary to the conventional SD KFZ-10, received a new angular armored body. It featured 8mm thick armor plates on the side and the rear, and 14.5mm on the front. The armor offered enough protection against small arms fire and shrapnels, but it couldn't stop bigger caliber weapons. The top was open, which allowed the troops to fire from the vehicle, but left them exposed to mortar or artillery fire, hand grenades, or enemy aircraft. In late 1943, the complex body shape was changed to a more simple one with flat sides. The vehicle used a 4.2-liter petrol engine, developing 100 horsepower. It could reach a maximum speed of 76 km an hour on roads and had a range of 300 km. The standard armament was 1 or 2 MG-34 machine guns. The German army used these vehicles in every role they could think of, and even the variants had sub-variants, not to mention the countless field modifications. There were radio vehicles, command vehicles, mortar carriers, self-propelled guns, the list goes on and on. Similarly to its smaller sibling, the SD KFZ-251 was also based on an existing vehicle. The base for this new armored personnel carrier was the SD KFZ-11 half-track, built by Hanomag. The new vehicle used the same drivetrain and tracks as the SD KFZ-11, but it received a new body which was very similar to an earlier Rheinmetall prototype. The armor protection was very similar to the smaller SD KFZ-250, with 14.5mm thick plates on the front and 8mm on the sides and the rear. This vehicle entered service in 1939, but production was very slow at the beginning. In 1939, only 232 were produced, and by the end of 1940, another 337 were finished. It had 4 main variants during its production. The original A and B models featured 2 angled plates on the front of the engine compartment and large bulging access doors on the back. The C model, introduced in 1942, featured a simplified front armor design, but kept the original rear doors. The final D model, that started production in 1943, was redesigned to simplify production and featured a simple angled backplate with flat doors. The SD KFZ-251 used the same 4.2-liter petrol engine as its smaller sibling, producing 100 horsepower. Its maximum speed was 52 km an hour, with a maximum range of 300 km. The basic armament was 2 MG-34 or MG-42 machine guns. Altogether, around 15,000 units were produced between 1939 and 1945. This vehicle also had a great amount of variants and sub-variants, and a dazzling array of different modifications. They were used in every role possible. The half-tracks were used in every theater of the war, but contrary to the German propaganda, they were not used in big numbers. They were costly and slow to manufacture. In the first years of the war, only SS groups and elite divisions received them. At the beginning of the Western campaign, around 500 of them were in use, and in 1941, when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, around 1,000 of them were available. The open-top design, though it allowed the troops to fight from the vehicle, also made them vulnerable, and in extreme climates, like in the Russian winter or in North Africa, the vehicle became extremely cold or extremely hot on the inside. Though later production increased, but there were never enough of these vehicles to actually play the role envisioned for them, all the motorized infantry riding them and following the tanks. As the war progressed, more and more of them were converted to special roles: fire support, anti-air, ambulance, and so on. Though they never had the numbers needed, these vehicles still became one of the icons of World War II. Many of them were restored and still around today. Chapter 2: The Duck and Ford GPA, the amphibious Allied vehicles. Most of you probably seen these vehicles in war movies or documentaries about World War II. So let's see what is the history behind these amphibious vehicles. We're gonna start with the bigger brother, which everyone just calls Duck. But its official name, DUKW, comes from the General Motors naming scheme. D stands for 1942 production series, U means utility, K means all-wheel drive, and the W stands for tandem rear axles. Even before the start of World War II, it was apparent to many army leaders that the biggest problem in amphibious landing operations is to supply the troops and land equipment for them. This would require special vehicles to bridge the gap between the landing barges and the troops on the beach. In 1942, the Office of Scientific Research and Development recruited Rod Stevens, a yacht designer, to help create a vehicle able to carry equipment and supplies in amphibious landing operations. The idea was to turn the already proven GMC CCKV truck into an amphibious vehicle capable of tackling the ocean waves. Stevens and his team came up with the first prototype in less than 40 days. But the vehicle at first drew a lot of criticism, as it looked cumbersome, bulky and huge. Many thought it won't be any use for the army at all. Fearing that the vehicle is just another jack of all trades, master of none, the risk of having soldiers' lives depend on it was too great. The project was on the verge of being terminated, when Palmer C. Putnam, the leader of amphibious research, convinced the army for a demonstration opportunity. The trials were set on the Atlantic coast of New England. In a strange twist of fate, a storm was brewing over the coastline, which seemed to cause the trials to be cancelled. But actually it turned out to be a stroke of luck for the Duck project. A Coast Guard ship nearby ran aground while returning to port, and that was just what Rod Stevens and the Duck crew needed. They swung into action, drove the Duck into the waves, and in a few minutes picked up the crew of the ship and safely returned them to the shore. With this demonstration, the Duck proved itself to be a very capable amphibious vehicle, and found support amongst the ranks. The Duck used the same frame, engine and drivetrain as the base CCKV truck, apart from the whole vehicle encased in a watertight body and propellers installed to provide propulsion in the water. The waterproofing of the vehicle was accomplished with watertight bearings and seals, but weekly maintenance and greasing was essential to keep them in good working order. It featured the same GMC 270 petrol engine as the base truck, providing 91 horsepower. The vehicle's top speed was about 50 miles an hour on land and 6.5 miles an hour in water. The maximum safe payload was around 2.5 tons, which sadly was exceeded many times, resulting in the sinking of many ducks together with their cargo. Another unique feature of the late model ducks many people don't know about, that it could regulate its tire pressure on the fly with an onboard compressor, which was a great help on loose beach surfaces. The first big operation for the Ducks came in July 1943, when they participated in the Allied landings at Sicily. 1,000 ducks were used in the landings, and they proved themselves to everyone who doubted them. In the landings, it turned out their usefulness and mobility was greatly underestimated. They transferred many tons of supplies, ammunition, and troops to the beaches. They were extremely useful in the shallow waters surrounding the island, where the bigger landing ships had trouble navigating. After their stellar performance in Sicily, the Allied plans relied on their participation when the forces landed in Normandy. In this operation, 2,000 ducks were used to supply the troops on the beachheads, delivering men and supplies between the ships and the shore, and taking the wounded out from the combat zone. After the Allies broke out from the beaches, the ducks' road-going capability was a real asset, as they could carry the supplies inland directly from the ships. The ducks were widely used in the Pacific as well, participating in all major landing operations. They were used at the landings at Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and many more. After World War II, there were several upgraded versions and experiments based on the duck. One of the most interesting ones was the so-called flying duck featuring hydrofoils in 1956. An upgrade over the original duck was the XM147, so-called Super Duck, developed also in the 1950s. Another interesting experiment was the XM157 Drake, but this one was too complicated and never gone into production. And of course, let us not forget the unavoidable Soviet copy of the vehicle, the ZIL-485. And now it's time to take a look at the little brother of the duck, the Ford GPA amphibious Jeep. After the initial first production run on the Jeep in 1941, a new project was set up for a light amphibious vehicle. Encouraged by the success of the duck, Rod Stevens was brought in to design the shape of the vehicle similarly as he did with the amphibious truck. This really showed on the Ford GPA, as it looks like a miniature version of the duck and operated the same way. The original specification set a 2,700 pound weight for this vehicle, though by the time it reached production, it was way heavier than that. There were two competitors for the production. One was the Ford Motor Company, the other is Marmon Harrington, a company specialized in all-wheel drive vehicles. We had a glimpse of one of their vehicles in my Jeep history video. If you haven't seen that yet, I recommend you watch it. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. The Marmon Harrington prototype was a unibody construction, while the Ford GPA used a conventional internal frame and chassis with welded-on panels. This made the Ford version about 400 pounds lighter than its competitor. Their design also reused as many parts from the original Ford Jeep as possible to keep the cost down and ensure interchangeability. As their design seemed to be better, Ford was given the contract in 1942. Sadly, the Ford GPA was a disappointment after the success of the duck. This comes down mainly to the weight of the vehicle, which in the end was nearly 3,500 pounds, instead of the originally planned 2,700 pounds. Though the vehicle was much heavier than originally planned, the volume of the body was not increased accordingly, so its carrying capacity and seaworthiness was decreased. The changing of the body was not really an option either, as the increased size and weight with the original 60 horsepower Jeep engine and drivetrain already caused the vehicle to be heavy and unwieldy on land. Production was actually stopped after just a bit more than a year in March 1943 because of the bad reception of the vehicle and financial indifferences between Ford and the government. Altogether, 12,700 units were built, from which 4,486 were sent to Allied countries, most of them to the Soviet Union. The Soviets actually copied this vehicle as well and built similar ones based on their own off-road vehicles. The Ford GPAs participated in the North African operations and the Sicily landings, and they served on until the end of the war. After the war, many GPAs were sold to civilians. Mostly farmers bought them, but many were converted by adventurers. From these two very similar amphibious vehicles, one was very successful and the other was not, but they were both certainly unique. Chapter 3: History of the World War II Jeep. The vehicle with more than 600,000 units produced in the few years of the war, the one that carried Allied soldiers around, climbed over obstacles, rushed to the back with wounded, transported ordinary soldiers and generals, the icon of World War II. Most people can even recall its iconic sound, the Jeep. You would think a vehicle so common and simple have a short history, but you'd be wrong. The Jeep's origins and history until it became what it is a longer one. So without wasting any more time, let's jump in. The US Army after the First World War started looking for lightweight and low silhouette vehicles to motorize the troops and replace the motorcycles and other vehicles. They were looking for something versatile that is capable of reconnaissance but could also carry some weaponry. However, the budget cuts after World War I slowed down these developments and they only sped up again in the late 1930s. Over the years, the Army experimented with several converted vehicles. There were some quite unique ideas, like the Howie Wiley machine gun carrier in 1937, but no real solution came forward before the start of World War II. Though by 1938 the Army had half-ton 4x4 trucks, such as the Dodge VC, which had good off-road performance, they were still too heavy and big for quick reconnaissance missions, and they weren't nimble enough off-road, so the search for the small light vehicle continued. After the war broke out in Europe, things suddenly sped up for the Army. On 11th of July 1940, the Army set up requirement for a quarter-ton 4x4 truck and sent it to US car manufacturers. The specification asked for, quote, general-purpose personal or cargo carrier especially adaptable for reconnaissance or command and designated as quarter-ton 4x4 truck, unquote. The Army was so much in a hurry that the requirements were very demanding. The car manufacturers had to enter their bids by 22nd of July, just 11 days after they received the requirements. After this, they had 49 days to present the first prototype and 75 days to finish 70 test vehicles. The technical specifications were very narrow as well. The vehicle must feature a 4x4 drivetrain, a wheelbase not more than 80 inches, and a maximum height of 40 inches with folded down windshield. It had to be able to carry 660 pounds of payload and weight no more than 1300 pounds. Because of the very strict requirements, only two manufacturers entered the competition, American Bantam and Willys Overland. The price from Willys was lower, but they required more time to finish a prototype, so American Bantam received the contract. Bantam brought in freelance engineer Carl Probst, who laid out the plans for the vehicle in just 2 days and worked out the cost of manufacture the next day, and Bantam submitted their bid on 22nd of July. The vehicle incorporated many off-the-shelf automotive parts, which helped a lot to meet the very narrow time frame. The first hand-built prototype, the Blitz Buggy, or Old Number 1, was delivered to the Army Test Center on 23rd of September 1940. It met all the requirements, except the original weight limit and the engine torque. Though American Bantam won the contract, it was realized as a small company they won't have the capacity to meet the amount of vehicles the Army will need. Willys and Ford were brought in to complete their prototypes. The Bantam blueprints were shared with them and their engineers were invited to the Bantam prototype testing. Both companies presented their own prototypes by November, and their testing began together with Bantam's BRC-60 vehicles. The Willys Quad was basically a copy of the Bantam prototype, while the Ford Pygmy showed some differences. It was the first example of the headlight moved inside the body to be more protected. The weight limit was raised to 2,160 pounds, as none of the vehicles could meet the original 1,300 pounds limit. By the time testing was concluded in the end of 1940, the Army were in even more of a hurry in the looming shadow of the war. The European allies were also very interested in acquiring these vehicles, so all 3 vehicles were accepted and 1,500 units of each were ordered. By 1941 the Jeep was in mass production. Bantam and Ford started rolling out the vehicles in March and Willys in June. The first production runs were relatively small numbers, the Bantam BRC-40 with 2,605 units, the Ford GP with 4,456 and the Willys MA with 1,553 manufactured before in July 1941 the War Department decided they need to standardize the whole production for these vehicles. Almost all of these early production models were supplied to the UK and Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Willys went out in the standardization process as their engine was the most powerful and their manufacturing cost was the lowest. The Willys MB was born incorporating the best bits of the 3 designs, most notable the front end of the Ford GP with the flat grille and the headlights under the hood. The standardized Jeep ended up with Willys' 2.2-litre Go Devil engine producing 60 horsepower, driving a 3-speed manual transmission. Its top speed was 65 miles an hour on road, 25 miles an hour off-road. It had a maximum range of 285 miles and weighed 2,293 pounds. As the need for the Jeeps were so high, Willys couldn't keep up with the orders, so in October 1941 Ford also received a contract to build the vehicles on license, including the Willys engine. Initially Ford offered to increase the output of their own engine, but the government declined it as they wanted full interchangeability. Ford had to build a complete manufacturing line for the Willys engine, but they managed to do that in record speed, and the first Ford GPW rolled out in January 1942. The W in the name stands for Willys. By the time the war ended, Willys produced more than 363,000 units, and Ford around 280,000. Bentham, the original company behind the Jeep concept, stopped producing them after the first batch in 1941, though they kept manufacturing trailers for the Jeeps. Unlike other military vehicles with many different setups and variations, the Jeeps were all the same when they left the factory. They were modified with add-on accessories, field kits and local field modifications to fit the roles they are needed for. As expected, being a military vehicle, the most numerous were the various gun placements on them. Between the countless field kits, there were ambulance racks, baggage racks, off-road modifications, waterproofing kits for landings. They were equipped with radios or used to tow equipment. Amongst the local field modifications were the widely known wire cutters, mostly used in the European theatre, various armor plating installations, some Jeeps were even modified to run on rails. During the war, there were many factory experiments to further develop the Jeep, but most of these didn't go to production. In 1942, tests were run to install the 37mm anti-tank gun on the Jeep, but operating the gun proved to be difficult on the small vehicle and it couldn't carry enough ammo either. This led to the building of special stretched 6-wheel drive versions featuring the 37mm gun called T13 and T14 models. These vehicles performed well in the tests, but by the time they were finished, the M6 gun motor carriage based on the 3/4-ton Dodge truck has been standardized. The longer 6-wheel drive chassis was not abandoned, it was tested in various roles as cargo or personal carrier, but even though its performance was very good, it was not needed as the same roles could be performed by the existing Dodge trucks. Another interesting experiment was a Jeep-based armored car, the T-24 Scout, built in 1942 on the same, longer 6-wheel drive chassis, but eventually it was dropped for the purpose-built M8 and M20 armored cars. I have already made a video on these armored cars, check the link in the description or at the end of this video. Ford had an interesting experiment which eventually made it into production. They developed the amphibious GPA version, which we will look at in a separate video in the future. The Jeep served in every theatre of World War II, and it was used by all Allied countries. Britain, Canada, the Soviet Union, India, Australia, China all used Jeeps. About 150,000 units were delivered to the UK, and 50,000 to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. The British used them by great effect in North Africa, not just as scouts or utility vehicles, but in bigger groups as a quick raiding force attacking German supply lines. They were used by every US branch in every theatre from Europe to the Pacific, in many roles, from post carrier to scouting, carrying wounded, to be used as a weapons platform. They were rugged, dependable, nimble and could be adapted to almost any role. The troops liked the Jeep. It wasn't comfortable, but it was dependable and they knew they can count on it to go where it needed to go and to do what needed to be done. The Jeep remained in service after the war and was used in the Korean and even in Vietnam Wars. In Korea, mostly the modernized M38 and M38A1 versions were used. By the time the Vietnam War broke out, Ford designed a much more modern replacement for the Jeep, the M151, which featured independent suspension and a unibody construction. This vehicle stayed in service up until 1990. The Jeep's legacy lives on in the civil life as well. Willys immediately after the war started marketing and selling their CJ, civilian Jeep models, which over the years grew more civilized but still carrying the legacy of the old World War II mule. Chapter 4: The German Kugelwagen and Schwimmwagen. Just as we see the American GIs driving a Jeep in every war movie or documentary, we see their rival too, the German soldier driving a Kugelwagen, the German equivalent of the Jeep in World War II. Or a somewhat rarer sight, the Schwimmwagen, the amphibious version. So let's see how these German rivals to the Jeep were developed and used in World War II. If you're interested in the history of the Jeep as well, I have already made a video on that, so I recommend you check that out. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. The story of these vehicles starts in the mid-1930s, when in Germany the Nazi Party developed a program called Strength Through Joy. In this program, amongst others, there was a plan to build the people's car, Volkswagen as we know it today, an affordable vehicle for German families, easy to produce and build, cheap to buy and maintain. By 1935 the prototypes were ready for the car, which would become the Volkswagen Beetle after the war. The Type 1 prototype designed by Ferdinand Porsche used cheap sheet metal construction and a rear-mounted air-cooled engine. Though mass production of the vehicle was planned to start in the late 1930s, It was almost immediately stopped when the war broke out. But years before that, as early as 1935, there were discussions of the military applications of the Volkswagen project. It was perfectly fit for military use by principle, cheap, easy and fast to produce, rugged and easy to maintain. So as the war approached, in 1938 official specifications were issued for a lightweight military vehicle. It had to be lightweight with good off-road capabilities and preferably not heavier than 950 kilograms, fully loaded, carrying 4 troops. The first prototype was ready just a month after the specifications were laid out. But as you can see, it was not much more than a stripped-down Volkswagen at that time. Porsche quickly realized that in order to achieve the required good off-road capabilities, the vehicle needs a lighter and also stronger chassis than the original. So he approached the coach builder Nicolas Trutz to help designing and building a new lightweight unibody for these vehicles. The Type 62 prototype was ready in late 1938 and testing began soon, comparing it against different vehicles, four-wheel drives as well. The original design didn't even have doors to save weight. It just used some sheets to prevent passengers from falling out. Though the Kubelwagen only had two-wheel drive and a small engine, it was very lightweight and surprisingly mobile off-road even in deep mud or snow, thanks to its smooth underbody and self-locking differential. It could keep up with any four-wheel drive vehicles of the time, and if it got stuck, it could easily be freed by the passengers, thanks to its lightweight construction. The development didn't stop though. The vehicle had a new body designed by 1939, receiving its signature more angular looks. Some of these pre-production models took part in the invasion of Poland as well, as a field test. The vehicle impressed the army overall, but some changes were implemented after the campaign. The improved Type 82 version received gear reduction hubs, more ground clearance, and bigger wheels. The mass production of the Type 82 started in February 1940, and more than 50,000 were produced during the war until 1945, with only minor modifications. The biggest change on the Kubelwagen was the switch to the bigger 1131cc engine in 1943. There were some experimental versions tested with four-wheel drive, but they didn't offer any significant advantage over the Type 82, so they didn't go to production. The final production versions of the Kubelwagen were first deployed during the Western Campaign in 1940, and after that they were used in every theater of the war by the German army. In the West, in the Eastern Front, and in North Africa as well. Now let's see the general technical specifications of the Kubelwagen. The vehicle was quite small, 3.7 meters long, 1.6 meters wide, and 1.65 meters tall. It weighed 715 kilograms and was powered by a 985cc air-cooled engine, producing 24 horsepower. Its maximum speed was 80 km an hour on roads and around 20-30 km an hour off-road. The maximum range of the vehicle was around 400 km. Let's compare it to its rival, the American Jeep. The Jeep was 3.32 meters long, 1.57 meters wide, and 1.75 meters tall. It weighed 1040 kilograms, but the more weight was compensated by its bigger 2.2-liter four-cylinder engine, developing 60 horsepower. Its maximum speed was 110 km an hour on roads and around 50 km an hour off-road, and it had a range of 450 kilometers. The US Army evaluated the Kubelwagens captured in North Africa, and though they found it inferior to the Jeep, they issued a very detailed field manual to the troops in case the vehicles were captured after the Normandy landings. The manual discusses the main features, normal operating as well as hot and cold weather instructions, and even repairing of the vehicle. The Kubelwagen did very well on all kinds of terrain, at all theaters of the war, but it had one drawback: it wasn't amphibious. And that takes us to its sibling, the Schwimmwagen. Though the Kubelwagen's four-wheel drive experimental versions didn't go to production, they weren't wasted. The plans were dusted off as soon as the army needed a new vehicle, similar to the Kubelwagen but amphibious. The thinking behind this vehicle was similar to what brought the Duck and the Ford GPA to life on the American side. to build an amphibious vehicle based on the one already in service with the Army. If you're interested in the history of the Duck and the Ford GPA, I already have a video on those vehicles. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. Just like as the Ford GPA was based on the Jeep, the new Schwimmwagen was based on the experimental four-wheel drive versions of the Kugelwagen. It had some differences though. It used a bigger 1131cc engine, a completely new body of course with enough buoyancy, a propeller on the back, and the four-wheel drive system. The first version of the vehicle, the Type 128, used the standard 2.4 meter wheelbase from the original Volkswagen cars and first appeared in 1940. The vehicle performed well, but immediately some faults were found. The body was too rigid, and on rough terrain it often developed cracks, which are not a welcome sign on an amphibious vehicle. The solution was found in a new shorter wheelbase body, which solved this problem. The new shorter variant, the Type 166, entered production in 1942. The Schwimmwagens first were used by special units like paratroopers and elite units like the SS. During the war they were deployed at almost all theaters, in the Western Front, the Eastern Front, North Africa and Italy. More than 15,000 of them were manufactured, making this type the most produced amphibious car in history. The Schwimmwagen was 3.8 meters long, 1.5 meters wide and 1.6 meters tall. It weighed 910 kilograms and used a 1130cc air-cooled engine producing 25 horsepower. It had a top speed of 80 km an hour on land and 10 km an hour in water. Its maximum range was 400 km. We can compare it to its American rival, the Ford GPA, which was 4.6 meters long, 1.6 meters wide, and 1.75 meters tall. It weighed 1110 kilograms and used the same 60 horsepower 2.2-liter petrol engine as the Jeep. It had a maximum speed of 70 km an hour on land and 10 km an hour in water. Though the Ford GPA was bigger and more powerful, the Schwimmwagen was actually a better amphibious car and had much better off-road capabilities. Though they were very basic designs from today's viewpoint, the Kugelwagen was a great car for its time. They were quite popular after the war, and Volkswagen even manufactured a successor, the Type 181, for the German army and to the civilian market from 1969. The Schwimmwagens are popular amongst the collectors, and today 189 surviving units are known. Chapter 5: The American M2 and M3 half-trucks. The mules of the US Army during World War II, these vehicles were used in many different roles, and they show up in every war movie or documentary as they move along the road in a long column. So let's see the history of the M2 and M3 half-trucks. The roots of these vehicles reach back to the 1930s. The US Army experimented with different types of light vehicles to be used as scout cars and personal carriers after World War I, and in the mid-1930s trialed a series of designs. The first of these vehicles developed by the White Motor Company was the M1 Scout Car in 1934. It was a four-wheel drive vehicle featuring half-an-inch thick armor plates and a maximum speed of 50 miles an hour. It was not really a purpose-built scout car though, more of a converted truck. Not long after, in 1935, it was immediately followed by the M2 version, which was larger and more powerful than its predecessor. The following M3 version was a more advanced development, showing some of the features which were later applied to the half-tracks too, like the skate rail for the machine gun around the body. This vehicle was further developed into the M3A1 Scout Car, which featured a wider body, a front roller, and an improved engine. This version has seen a production run of more than 20,000 units between 1939 and 1944. And when we look at the picture, we can already guess how the half-tracks were developed. In the late 1930s, after the Scout cars went into service with the US military, the cavalry found that their off-road capabilities are lacking. Despite the four-wheel drive, in deep mud or on wet terrain, they had troubles, as the vehicle weighted almost 6 tons and the wheels easily sunk into the soft ground. The US Army experimented with half-track vehicles before, using French Citroën Kégresse vehicles. So in 1938 the White Company took the rear suspension from the T9 half-track truck and mated it with the M3 Scout car. This vehicle was the T7 half-track. The new vehicle had much better off-road capabilities than the Scout cars, due to its much lower ground pressure and better traction. But during testing it was found to be very underpowered, especially as it was intended for multiple roles, including prime mover and artillery tractor. Nonetheless, it provided valuable information. So when in 1939 it became clear the Army needs a large number of half-tracks for various roles, and the Ordnance Department laid out specifications for an armored half-track designated T14, the experiences collected with the T7 were applied. The pilot vehicle was built in the first months of 1940 and was tested at Aberdeen from May until September. The vehicle needed some refinements though, as in its original form it didn't meet all the expectations. Mainly the rear suspension needed modifications, as to speed up building the vehicle, the T7 rear suspension was used, featuring a rear drive sprocket, steel bogies, and 10-inch wide tracks, while the specification asked for front sprocket drive, 12-inch wide tracks, and rubber bogies. The Ordnance Committee ordered it to be standardized as half-track car M2 with a capacity of carry 10 men. A version which was extended by 10 inches was standardized as half-track personal carrier M3. For these vehicles, the white 160A engine was selected. The Army needed so many of the new half-tracks that one manufacturer wouldn't have been able to fulfill the orders. So Autocar Company, Diamond T Motor Company, and White Motor Company all received orders. The three companies and the Ordnance Department held a meeting in October 1940 to make sure all the vehicles are standardized and the parts will be interchangeable. The first production vehicles were delivered in May 1941. As we mentioned, the body of the M3 variant was 10 inches longer, but mechanically the two vehicles were similar and featured similar armor protection. The M3 had its internal arrangement changed, the fuel tanks moved, and additional seats installed to carry more passengers. The development of the vehicles didn't stop after they entered production. On the field several problems occurred with the new vehicles, and the biggest was the idler in the rear suspension. Originally it was a fixed piece which didn't allow enough compensation on rough terrain, and the vehicles often damaged their rear suspension or throw the track because of that. While the Ordnance Department were thinking about changing the design, the men at the 2nd Armored Division came up with their own solution, replacing the fixed idler with an eye bolt, a nut, and a coil spring, which solved the problem. The modification worked so well that the suggestion was brought up the command chain to Ordnance, where it was approved and the parts were bought to modify all the half-tracks. A bit later in early 1943, a more advanced double-spring idler modification was ordered in production. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the expansion of the Army resulted in such a need for half-tracks, which the three original manufacturing companies couldn't cope with, so International Harvester Company was brought in. The International Harvester models used some new parts, but the overall layout followed the same configuration, and their performance was similar to the other half-tracks. They have some identifying features though, mainly the different shaped front fenders, and because they were built with welded construction, the rounded corners on the back. The variants built by this company were standardized summer 1942 as half-track car M9 and half-track personal carrier M5. In mid-1942, the gun mounts on the half-tracks were upgraded as well to use a ring gun overhead, and these versions were standardized as M2A1, M3A1, M5A1, and M9A1 versions. Now let's take a look at the main variants of these half-tracks. The base variants of the M2 half-track car were the original M2, which featured the skate rail gun mount, the M2A1 with the improved ring gun mount, and the M9 version built by International Harvester. Though by the time this would go to production, the improved gun mounts were adopted, so basically all of them were built as M9A1 variants. The M3 models were similarly developed, with the original M3 as the base model, the M3A1 featuring the ring gun mount, and the M5 and the upgraded M5A1 versions built by International Harvester. The M2 had two main self-propelled gun variants. The M4 with an 81mm M1 mortar, which was meant to be fired after dismounting, but later the A1 update was meant to be fired from the vehicle. The other was the M2 equipped with a 37mm gun, the same anti-tank gun that was mounted on the M6 gun motor carriage. The bigger M3 had more variants. The most well-known is the 75mm M3 gun motor carriage, carrying the M1897 75mm gun. The T19 howitzer motor carriage was equipped with the M2A1 105mm howitzer. Another variant of the T19 was equipped with the 81mm mortar. The T30 75mm howitzer motor carriage was equipped with the M1A1 75mm howitzer. Almost 1,000 units were built from the T48 gun motor carriage, equipped with the M1 57mm gun. Most of these were supplied to the Allies through Lend-Lease, and the majority of them went to the Soviet Union, where they were called Su-57s. The half-tracks were one of the longest-serving vehicles in the US Army. Already in service before World War II and still in use well after the war. They were first used in the defense of the Philippines against the Japanese. In the fight, they were a valuable asset as self-propelled artillery. Later, during Operation Torch, the landing in North Africa, almost all the half-track variants participated. The personnel carriers, self-propelled guns, and anti-aircraft variants too. At first the M3 gun motor carriage was used as a tank destroyer, but not too long, as soon the purpose-built M10 took their place. I have already made a video on the M10 tank destroyers. If you're interested in the history of those vehicles, I recommend you check it out. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. The half-tracks were used all through the African campaign, and later in Sicily and Italy as well. They participated in the Normandy landings, where the anti-aircraft variants were valuable of keeping the enemy aircraft away from the beaches. These variants were later used for infantry support as well, as the 450 caliber machine guns could lay down a very effective suppressive fire. They were used heavily on the Pacific as well during the island hopping campaign. Again, using all the variety of the half-tracks, the M3 gun motor carriage, the M16 and M15 anti-aircraft variants. They were used in all theaters of the war in many roles, and many Allied countries received them too: the Soviet Union, the British, the Free French, the Canadians, the Australians. They stayed in service after World War II and participated in the Korean War as well, particularly the M16 and M15 anti-aircraft variants, which were again used many times for infantry support. In this role, the crew of the gun was unprotected against enemy fire, so a folding shield was developed to protect the loaders in combat. During the 1950s, most of them were phased out from the US service, but they were used long after by other countries. They participated in the Arab-Israeli War in 1948, the Indochina War, the Suez Crisis, in the Six-Day War, and even in the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The half-tracks were an important part of the Allied armies, and they served in many roles at all theaters of the war. Chapter 6: The M8 Greyhound Armored Car. The original specification for these vehicles were laid out in 1941 as a light-wheeled tank destroyer to replace the M6 gun motor carriage. The requirements were a 6x4 drive vehicle armed with the 37mm gun, which in the early years of the war seemed adequate, a coaxial and a hull-mounted machine gun. Its armor had to be strong enough to withstand 50 caliber machine gun fire. As it happened many times during the war, by the time it entered development, its original concept became obsolete. The
the 37mm gun was not powerful enough anymore to fill the tank destroyer role. However, in the early stages of World War II, American planners observed how Germany used their forces as combined arms to conquer other countries. Key part of their success was light reconnaissance units collecting intelligence moving in front of the main forces. Based on these observations, the specification for the M8 were changed to light armored car, and it was meant to be used as a light reconnaissance vehicle. Now let's move to design and development. 3 prototypes were submitted by Studebaker, Ford and Chrysler, named T21, 22 and 23. From these, the Chrysler and Ford versions were developed further, and ultimately the Ford vehicle won out. It was built on a 6x6 chassis, mounted the 37mm gun and a hull-mounted machine gun, though several design changes were implemented before serial production, like removal of the hull machine gun and other small changes. The prototype T22E2 was ready in early 1942 and received its formal designation Light Armored Car M8 in May the same year. But the first production vehicle only left the manufacturing plant in March 1943, with the first units supplied to the army in November. The name Greyhound actually came from the British, who also received the M8, but they felt it was too thinly armored, so it see little action, mostly used in the Italian campaign at the end of the war. The M8 has a distinctive shape thanks to the well-sloped armor and its 6 wheels, making it easily recognizable between World War II vehicles. They were all equipped with long-range radios to communicate with headquarters and short-range radios to communicate with other vehicles. Now let's move on to the armament. The M8 mounted the 37mm M6 gun, a coaxial 30 caliber machine gun, and an anti-aircraft 50 caliber machine gun. The armament was perfectly capable of dealing with infantry and enemy light vehicles, but if the M8 encountered heavy enemy armor, it used its low profile and quiet engine to stay concealed or its speed to break away from combat situations. Armor. On the hull, it had 12 to 19mm of armor on the front and 9.5mm on the side. The turret had 19mm all around. The vehicle's armor was very thin and only provided protection to small arms fire. Especially problematic was the floor, which was only 6mm thick and made it vulnerable to landmines. Later models received added floor armor to address this problem, but the added weight resulted in modifications needed on the suspension as well. Power plant and performance. The M8 had a Hercules GXD 6-cylinder engine producing 110 horsepower. The maximum speed was 55 miles an hour on roads and 30 miles an hour off-road. The engine was well light for its quiet operation, and under normal circumstances it was powerful enough, but in the Italian mountains or the deep snow in the Ardennes it proved to be underpowered. M8 variants and production numbers. T22, the first prototype. M8E1 with the modified suspension. M20 armored car. This had the turret removed altogether and only retained the 50 caliber machine gun as armament. T69 multiple gun carriage prototype. In 1943, a prototype was tested equipped with 4 50 caliber machine guns as an anti-aircraft vehicle, but it was never got into production. Some interesting variants from after World War II. M8 TOW tank destroyer. The main gun was removed and replaced with a TOW missile launcher. M8 H90. This was a French variant equipped with a 90mm gun. In total, between 1943 and 1945, more than 12,000 M8 and M20 armored cars were manufactured. Combat history. The M8 entered service in the Sicily campaign in 1943 and saw use by the US Army in Italy and Western Europe. It was also deployed to the Pacific and used on Okinawa and the Philippines, and in this theater it was even used in its original tank destroyer role against the thinly armored Japanese tanks. In general, its performance has varied reviews, as though it was fast enough on roads, off-road capabilities were lacking. On rough terrain or in deep snow, it was confined to using roads, making it less usable as a reconnaissance vehicle. After World War II. After the war, as the army downsized, many M8 and M20 armored cars were donated or sold to other countries. The ones that remained in US service were used in the Korean War as well, mainly as military police vehicles, but after the Korean War, they were deemed obsolete and got decommissioned. Most of them were given to friendly countries, and some of them were purchased by different police organizations as riot control vehicles. After the war in Europe, France were the biggest user of the M8 cars, and with various modifications used some of them up until 1975. The M8 is still in use in several smaller countries up to this day.
Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.